Killer Stories. I'm your host, Bobby Holmes. Before we get started, I want to thank KM Jewelry for sponsoring today's episode. Kyle Megan Elliott is the designer and handcrafts every single piece. About 3 years ago, Kyle was an office manager with a side hustle. She started making jewelry using leather and faux leather. The business has grown so much that she recently quit her job. Creating unique pieces of jewelry is now her full-time business. In her online store, you can find a wide variety of rings, earrings, necklaces, and bracelets. Those of you watching on YouTube can see pictures of the gorgeous pieces that Kyle sent me. I'll be sure to share on my social media as well. I think my favorite thing that she sent are these glazed polymer clay earrings. Clay jewelry is all the rage right now. And check out this custom stamped necklace that Kyle sent me. It says Killer Stories on it. It's so cute. I love it. KM Jewelry is affordable, quality, comfortable, on-trend accessories. And there's something for everyone. And I might add the perfect stocking stuffer. Visit shopkmjewelry.com. She offers free shipping over $40 purchases within the US. Now through the end of 2021, you can get 15% off using the code KILLER15 at checkout. I'll leave the shopping link and the discount code in the show notes as well. This week's case was suggested by listener Emily Spencer. She wrote in via email and asked me to cover the murder of Jeralee Underwood. This took place in Pocatello, Idaho, which is just about 2 hours north from where I live in Utah. And I think this warrants a trigger warning. The victim is a child, and what was done to her is pretty horrific. I mean, honestly, that's the case just about every week, but it just seems extra terrible when it's an 11-year-old girl. It's so frustrating to me that most of the information on this case is about the murderer, not the victim. I wish I knew more about Jeralee. All I could find is that she grew up in a devout Mormon household. She was a straight-A student and vice president of the student council. She enjoyed arts, crafts, and especially loved to read. She was a hard worker, and at age 11, she already had a job delivering newspapers. So without any more background on her, we're literally jumping right into it. On June 29th, 1993, Jeralee was on her normal paper route when she approached a home to make a collection. At that moment, James Wood was eating dinner with his cousin, the homeowner. As she walked away, James followed. Like I said, I know very little about Jeralee, but James, I know all the horrible details. He was born December 9th, 1947 in Louisiana. His father went to prison when he was just a baby. After that, his mother, Hazel Godwin, moved them to Pocatello, Idaho, so they could start a new life. James was an unruly child. As early as kindergarten, he was extremely defiant to any and all authority figures. When he was 8, his mother died in a large fire at the potato plant where she worked. Since his father was in prison, he was left without either biological parent. When they moved to Pocatello, Hazel had remarried. His stepfather was an absolute piece of shit. He abused James in every way possible. Physically, emotionally, sexually, you name it. Choosing not to live with his stepfather, he was raised by his Uncle Gene and Aunt Mildred. By age 9, James was having, quote, violent sexual fantasies. Let me repeat that. 9 years old. I'm sure this stemmed from the physical and sexual abuse of his stepfather. Why is it so hard for people to just be decent human beings? James was admitted to the St. Anthony's Youth Correctional Center on 3 different occasions due to his criminal activity. For a young teen, he racked up some serious offenses, like stealing cars and arson. He would routinely set fires to dumpsters. When he was 14 years old, he became a ward of the state, meaning he's a minor under the protection of the government. His aunt and uncle chose not to care for James any longer due to his behavioral issues. Through his teenage years, he continued education at a reform school, and he absolutely hated it there, attempting to escape 7 times. Out of those 7 tries, 1 was successful. He got his hands on a knife and used it to threaten a guard, who I imagine was like, I don't get paid enough to deal with this, and just let him go. James's biological father was released from prison when he was 17. The reform school allowed for his departure given he left the state and moved to Louisiana with his father. He had his own business selling and installing chain-link fences. James was his newest employee. 2 years later, on Christmas Eve, James came across a colt, a baby male horse, that was tied to a tree. He was a Christmas present for a lucky young boy. But when that family woke up on Christmas morning, they discovered that the colt had been slaughtered. And you guessed it, James was responsible. He's expressing the early signs of a killer, arson and cruelty to animals. I didn't read anything about him being a bedwetter, but I wouldn't be surprised. When James was 20, he married a woman named Angie Bell. Their marriage was short-lived. They did have a child together, but Angie filed for divorce not long after giving birth. She found out about James's criminal past and wanted nothing to do with him. When he was 22, he graduated from robbery and arson to sexual assault and was arrested for rape. Angie, God bless her, she doesn't make a whole lot of sense here. She divorced James because of his criminal record. Then he commits rape, and the woman decides to marry him again. They have their second child together, and then Angie files for another divorce, this time for good. James serves his time for the rape charge at Angela State Penitentiary. When he was released in 1986, he moved to Texas to live with his half-brother, Ernest Arnold. James landed a job working as a truck driver. One of my sources, Murderpedia, states that Ernest kicked James out of his house due to, quote, his relationship with a gay man. I assume this means romantic relationship, but I wasn't able to verify these details anywhere else. 6 years pass before James makes his way back towards Pocatello, but on his way, he makes a pit stop to rob a Pizza Hut in Denver, Colorado. He shows up on the doorstep of his cousin, Dave Haggard. Dave invites James to stay while looking for a place of his own. While living with Dave, a 45-year-old James becomes fixated on young girls in the area. He abducted a 15-year-old girl named Beth Edwards from a Pizza Hut parking lot and raped her. James started dating again and ended up raping the 14-year-old daughter of his new girlfriend. After robbing a Sizzler in Salt Lake City, he picked up a woman walking the streets and raped her as well. I feel like a restaurant is a really weird thing to burglarize. It must be after hours or while the staff is closing up. I can't imagine walking in during a dinner rush with a ski mask and demanding cash. And these are just the confirmed rapes committed by James. We will cover his entire life of crime later in the story. So now we're all caught up with our perp. Back to our case. On June 29th, 1993, James was eating dinner with his cousin when Jeralee Underwood walked up the steps to collect a fee for the paper deliveries. James saw this as an opportunity. He got in his car and followed her as she left. He told his cousin that he was making a booze run. He drove up beside Jeralee and explained that the check they wrote her was going to bounce and to let him give her some cash instead. She opened her collection bag and started thumbing through her pile looking for the check. While she was preoccupied with her bag, James forced her into the car. Jerelee's parents, Jeff and Joyce, were at home working outside in the garden. A friend that they knew from church called the house and asked them if Jeralee had help with her paper route. Confused, they asked what she meant by that. She goes on to say that she saw Jeralee getting into a car with a man and was calling out of concern. None of this felt right to them. Jeff and Joyce called the police immediately to report their daughter being abducted. Jeff started his own search looking for Jeralee around the area she was last seen. Joyce waited at home just in case this was all a misunderstanding. As far as her normal schedule goes, she was due home any minute. But the Underwoods' worst fears were realized when day turned to night and there was still no sign of Jeralee. The next day, an extensive search was conducted looking for the 11-year-old. The Underwoods went door to door asking if anyone had seen her, while the police tried to track the vehicle in question. The witness said it was a light cream and white car. Jeralee was last seen wearing a Utah Jazz shirt and ball cap. The description of her kidnapper was a clean-shaven man in his 30s, about 5'7", wearing a plaid shirt and dark hat. He was actually a short, pudgy 45-year-old man with a mustache, and he wore his hair slicked back in a ponytail. But the witness stated she only saw him for a brief second. That night, a gathering was held at the LDS church where the Underwoods attended. Over 1,000 people showed up to pray for the safe return of Jeralee. Back to the kidnapping. Once he picked her up, he drove Jeralee around Pocatello and ended up in Idaho Falls. During this time, James repeatedly molested and raped her. The next day, he let her out of the car to go pee by some bushes. He came up behind her and shot Jeralee in the back of the head using a .22 caliber pistol. Unsure of what to do with the body, he just simply covered it with surrounding brush and debris. His pathetic attempt to hide the body did the trick. Days went by and no one discovered Jeralee. But James knew that she would be found sooner or later, so he returned to the crime scene. He took off Jeralee's clothes and began dismembering her body. He decapitated her, cut off her arms, legs, and carved out her, quote, sex organs. My initial thought was her reproductive organs, but then I wondered if someone like James Wood would even know what the internal organs of a female looked like. So this is probably referring to her vaginal area. After dismembering her body, he threw all of the body parts along with her clothing into the Snake River. Soon after, the majority of her remains were discovered floating in the river. They were not able to find her right hand or right calf. Jeff, Jerely's father, said that the mortician did the best he could to assemble her body back together for her funeral, so the family could see her one last time. July 6, 1993, James Wood was arrested for the murder of Jeralee Underwood. The sources for this case are somewhat limited, and I have scoured up and down every single one. I cannot find how he was ultimately linked to the murder, which is driving me crazy. They did have a description of his vehicle, so maybe that was what finally led police to their guy. James confessed to the crime, as well as a slew of other rapes and murders over the years. He admitted to 85 rapes, over 180 robberies, and a dozen murders. One woman came forward about her interaction with James Wood. He raped her in front of her toddler and put a gun to her head. He pulled the trigger, but the gun jammed. He told her it was her lucky day and left. But Jeralee is the only confirmed murder. 4 women came forward saying that they were raped by James Wood. He was charged and convicted of kidnapping, first-degree murder, sexual mutilation, and dismemberment. He was sentenced to death. James filed an appeal saying that he was unjustly given the death penalty. He thinks because the judge was a fellow member of the Underwood's LDS ward that he gave him an unwarranted sentencing. But his appeal was denied. He was given the death penalty because this was considered an especially heinous crime, and the judge finds this a justified execution. He was sent to the Idaho Maximum Security Institution to await his execution date. But he died of natural causes before that could happen. February 1st, 2004, James Wood passed away from an apparent heart attack. Jeralee's parents are still trying to heal from the loss of their only daughter. Jeff said something that actually helped him was researching James Wood. Learning about his upbringing actually made him feel some compassion. He said, quote, "To see his situation with his life as a child and teenager, I can maybe begin to see why he made the choices he did," unquote. I tell you what, he is a big man with a big heart if he can feel compassion for a man like James Wood. But I'm glad that the Underwoods are able to get some sort of closure. Thanks again to Emily Spencer for suggesting this case. If you would like to send in a story suggestion or inquire about sponsoring an episode, email me at killerstoriespodcast@gmail.com. Follow me on social media. I'm Killer Stories Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. You can find me on Twitter at Killer Stories PC. If you want to help support the show, you can visit buymeacoffee.com/killerstories to make a one-time donation. Thank you to Rachel for the 5 beers. She wrote, "Thank you for being my weekly escape." Speaking of weekly, I am taking a break next week for Thanksgiving. I'll be back in December. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please take a moment to write me a review. It's been a while since I've gotten a new one, and I know I have new listeners coming in every week. I love hearing feedback from you guys. Don't forget to check out KM Jewelry. The link for shopping and the discount code will be in the show notes. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, this has been a killer story.